October 1943. Inside a converted munitions testing facility outside Kummersdorf, the morning air carried the scent of cordite and autumn frost. The wooden benches were scarred from years of rifle testing, and the walls still bore chalk marks from ballistic calculations that no longer mattered. Germany was winning on paper, but the men in that room could feel the tide shifting in ways the High Command refused to acknowledge. Under the harsh glare of overhead lamps sat a weapon that looked like a child's toy compared to the Karabiner 98 that had armed the Wehrmacht since before the Great War. It was an American M1 Carbine, captured from a paratrooper near Salerno 3 weeks earlier. The stock was scratched, the barrel streaked with Italian dust, but the action was clean, oiled, and somehow still gleaming despite the rough handling of transport. Hauptmann Ernst Richter circled the weapon slowly, hands clasped behind his back. Around him, a dozen ordnance. Specialists from the Waffenamt, the Army Weapons Agency, gathered in silence. They had seen captured Allied weapons before. British Enfields, Soviet Mosin Nagants, even French rifles from the first days of the war. But this thing puzzled them in ways they could not yet articulate. Barely 3 kilograms. No rifle this size can be effective beyond 200 meters. Another leaned closer, squinting at the receiver. Look at the stampings. Multiple manufacturers. Different factory codes. They're mixing parts from across the country. Richter said nothing. He picked up the carbine, feeling its balance. The stock was walnut, smooth and simple. The sling swivel rotated freely. The rear sight was adjustable but crude, nothing like the precision apertures on a German Mauser. Everything about it screamed mass production, not craftsmanship, yet it felt alive in his hands. He had spent 15 years evaluating infantry weapons, from the elegant Gewehr 43 to the experimental FG-42 paratroop rifle. This carbine defied every principle he had been taught. It was too short for long-range accuracy, too light for sustained fire. The 30 caliber cartridge it chambered was underpowered compared to the full-sized 8mm Mauser round. By every measure, it should have been a failure. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But then Richter noticed something that made him pause. The magazine release was a simple button on the right side of the receiver. He pressed it. The magazine dropped free into his palm with a metallic click. 15 rounds. He stared at the curved steel box, then at the carbine, then back at the magazine. 15 rounds in a weapon this light. The standard Karabiner 98 held 5 rounds in an internal magazine, loaded one by one through stripper clips. The MP40, submachine gun, issued only to squad leaders and vehicle crews, held 32 rounds but fired pistol ammunition effective only at close range. This American weapon sat somewhere in between a rifle and a submachine gun, yet it was neither. He turned to his team. How many of these have the Americans produced? A young intelligence officer consulted a folder. Field reports suggest they're issuing them to support troops, vehicle crews, officers, paratroopers. We estimate production in the hundreds of thousands. Richter's jaw tightened. Hundreds of thousands. The entire Wehrmacht had fewer than 2 million rifles in service across all fronts. If the Americans were producing intermediate weapons at that scale, it meant something fundamental had changed in their thinking. The room fell silent except for the distant sound of artillery practice from the proving grounds. Outside, snow had begun to fall, dusting the pine trees that surrounded the facility. Inside, the German ordnance experts stood around a weapon that represented a philosophy they did not yet understand. Richter set the carbine down gently on the bench. "Tomorrow, we test it," he said. "Full firing trials. Compare it to the Kar-98, the MP40, and the FG-42. I want accuracy data, rate of fire, reliability under stress. Find its weaknesses." His voice was steady, but his mind was racing. The Americans had not built this weapon to win target competitions. They had built it to arm an entire army with firepower that could be wielded by anyone, from a clerk to a combat engineer. It was democratized lethality, stripped of tradition and prestige. The kind of weapon a nation with infinite resources would create when it valued quantity over heritage. One of the engineers picked up the empty magazine, turning it over in his hands. The steel was stamped, not forged. The follower spring was simple, almost crude. The feed lips showed no hand fitting. "It's built like a farm tool," he said dismissively. Richter nodded slowly. "Yes, and farms feed armies." That night, after the others had left, Richter remained in the testing hall. He reassembled the carbine in the dim light, the pieces fitting together with surprising ease. No specialized tools required, no armorer's touch needed. A soldier could strip and clean this weapon in the field with nothing but his hands and a piece of cloth. He thought about the Kar-98, a masterpiece of bolt-action engineering. Each one required skilled hands to fit the bolt to the receiver, to ensure the headspace was precise, to true the barrel. It was a weapon worthy of a rifleman, a soldier who understood his craft. But it took time to build, time to master, and time was something Germany no longer possessed in abundance. The M1 Carbine asked nothing of its user, except to load and fire. It forgave poor maintenance. It accepted rough handling. It was a weapon designed not for the best soldiers, but for every soldier. Richter set the carbine down and walked to the window. Beyond the frosted glass, the lights of Berlin glowed faintly on the horizon, dimmed by blackout regulations. Somewhere out there, factories worked through the night producing rifles that would arm the Reich's defenders. But those rifles were made the old way, one careful piece at a time. He wondered how many M1 carbines the Americans had built that day, how many magazines they had stamped, how many rounds they had pressed into those magazines, ready to be fired by men who had never touched a rifle before the war. The answer frightened him more than any battlefield report. As he turned to leave, his boot kicked something on the floor. It was a single spent cartridge case, .30 caliber, stamped with the head stamp WCC 43, Winchester Cartridge Company, 1943. He picked it up, holding it to the light. The brass was clean, uniform, factory perfect. Millions like it were being produced every month. He pocketed the casing and left the hall. Behind him, the M1 Carbine sat on the bench in darkness, waiting for the test that would reveal truths the German army was not prepared to accept. The men who would fire it tomorrow believed they were evaluating a weapon. They did not yet understand they were confronting a system, an industrial philosophy that had turned warfare into a matter of logistics rather than skill. In the stillness, the carbine seemed to whisper a question that would echo through the coming months. What happens when firepower becomes commonplace? When every soldier, regardless of rank or specialty, carries the means to fight back? The answer lay not in the weapon itself, but in the nation that built 15-round magazines faster than its enemies could reload 5-round clips. The next morning arrived cold and grey. Frost clung to the grass of the firing range, and the target frames stood like sentinels in the mist. Richter and his team assembled at 0600 hours, their breath visible in the frigid air. The M1 Carbine sat on a field table alongside its German counterparts, the Karabiner 98K, the MP40, and a rare FG-42 automatic rifle brought from Luftwaffe paratroop stocks. The comparison was meant to be clinical, methodical. Instead, it would become a revelation. Richter assigned the task of first firing to Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann, a veteran infantryman with 8 years of service. Hartmann had fought in Poland, France, and Russia. He knew rifles the way a musician knows instruments. He picked up the Kar-98 first, working the bolt with practiced ease. 5 rounds loaded. He settled into a prone position, aimed at a target 100 meters downrange, and fired. Crack, bolt back, crack, bolt back, crack, 5 rounds in 12 seconds. Each shot deliberate, controlled. The target showed a tight group, all within the center ring. Hartmann rose, brushing frost from his tunic. The Mauser was a familiar friend, reliable and true. Next came the MP40. Hartmann transitioned to standing, the submachine gun held at hip level. He fired a burst. The characteristic hollow clatter of 9mm rounds echoed across the range. 32 rounds emptied in 4 seconds. The target at 50 meters was shredded, but beyond that distance, the spread was wild. Effective, Hartmann said, but only at close quarters. Richter nodded. That was expected. The MP40 was a trench weapon, designed for room clearing and urban fighting. Now the M1 Carbine. Hartmann picked it up, his expression skeptical. He examined the 15-round magazine, slid it into the receiver with a solid click, and pulled the charging handle. The bolt slammed forward with a sharp metallic snap. He raised the carbine to his shoulder. The length of pull felt strange, shorter than a Mauser. The sights were low, almost instinctive. He fired. The crack was sharper than the Mauser, lighter than the MP40. The recoil was negligible. Before anyone could comment, Hartmann fired again. And again. The semi-automatic action cycled smoothly, each trigger pull producing another round without the need to work a bolt. In 8 seconds, he had emptied the magazine. 15 rounds downrange. He lowered the weapon, staring at it as if it had performed magic. Richter walked to the target. The group at 100 meters was loose but combat effective. Every round had hit within a man-sized silhouette, not sniper precision, but more than adequate for suppressive fire. He turned back to Hartmann. Your assessment? Hartmann set the carbine down carefully, almost reverently. It's faster than a bolt action, and more accurate than a submachine gun. If I had this in Russia, I would have killed twice as many before needing to reload. The words hung in the cold air. Richter gestured to another soldier, a younger man named Weber who had only 6 months of training. Fire the same course, he ordered. Weber approached the table nervously. He loaded the car, 98, fumbled with the bolt, and fired 5 rounds in 20 seconds. His group was scattered, 2 shots, missing the target entirely. The MP40 was worse. The burst climbed uncontrollably, stitching the target frame and the dirt berm behind it. But when Weber fired the M1 Carbine, something changed. The light recoil allowed him to stay on target. The semi-automatic action eliminated the need for bolt manipulation. He emptied the magazine in 10 seconds, and while his group was wider than Hartmann's, 12 of 15 rounds hit the silhouette. Richter felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This weapon forgave inexperience. It turned clerks into riflemen. The implications were staggering. An older engineer, Dr. Friedrich Lang, spoke from behind his clipboard. The rate of fire is irrelevant if the cartridge lacks stopping power. 30 caliber carbine is anemic compared to 8mm Mauser. Richter nodded. Test penetration. They set up pine boards at 50 meters, stacked to simulate cover. The Kar 98 punched through 4 boards cleanly. The MP40 barely penetrated 2. The M1 Carbine went through 3 boards and lodged in the 4th. Not equal to a rifle, Lang said, but superior to a pistol cartridge. Richter picked up the carbine again, weighing it in his hands. But it's not meant to replace the rifle. It's meant to replace the pistol and the submachine gun. A soldier who would have carried a Luger now carries this. A radio operator, a mortar crew, a truck driver, all armed with something more than a sidearm. One of the younger engineers interrupted. But Herr Hauptmann, why would the Americans waste resources arming support troops with such a weapon? Combat soldiers need rifles. Richter looked at him for a long moment. Because in their doctrine, every soldier is a combat soldier. They don't distinguish between frontline infantry and rear echelon. Everyone is expected to fight. The concept was foreign to the German military, where specialization was doctrine. Artillerymen fired guns, riflemen carried rifles, support troops stayed behind the lines. The American philosophy seemed wasteful, inefficient, but as Richter stared at the 15-round magazine lying on the table, he realized it was something else entirely. It was insurance. Insurance against being overrun. Insurance against ambush. Insurance that even a cook or a clerk could hold ground until reinforcements arrived. They continued testing through the afternoon. Rapid magazine changes. The M1 Carbine's magazine dropped free with a button press and seated with a firm push. A trained soldier could reload in 3 seconds. firing from different positions. The carbine was light enough to shoot accurately from standing, kneeling, or prone, without fatigue. Reliability testing. They fired 200 rounds without cleaning. One failure to feed, caused by a damaged magazine lip. They replaced the magazine and continued without issue. By 1600 hours, the data was clear. The M1 carbine was not a precision instrument. It was a tool, designed for mass use by soldiers of varying skill levels. And it worked. Richter called the team together as shadows lengthened across the range. "Gentlemen, summarize your findings." Lang spoke first. "The weapon is effective within 200 meters. Beyond that, accuracy degrades significantly. The cartridge lacks sufficient energy for long-range engagements or heavy cover penetration. Acceptable for defensive use, inadequate for offensive operations." Another engineer added, "The construction is simplified to an extreme. Stamped parts, minimal machining. This weapon is designed to be produced in enormous quantities with unskilled labor." Hartmann, the combat veteran, gave the final word. "If the enemy can put one of these in the hands of every support soldier, every officer, every specialist, they multiply their combat power without increasing their infantry strength. We would face an army where every man is armed with more than a pistol." Richter nodded slowly. He had reached the same conclusion hours earlier, but hearing it spoken aloud made it undeniable. The M1 carbine was not a threat because it was superior. It was a threat because it was ubiquitous. He thought of the production figures. Hundreds of thousands already built, perhaps millions by war's end, each one feeding 15 rounds as fast as a soldier could pull the trigger, each one light enough to carry all day without exhaustion, each one simple enough to be maintained by a conscript with a week of training. The Germans had nothing equivalent. The Kar-98 was too slow, the MP40 too specialized, the FG-42 too complex and expensive to produce in meaningful numbers. They had built weapons for professionals. The Americans had built weapons for an army of amateurs who would become proficient through sheer volume of fire. As the team packed the weapons for transport back to the facility, Richter remained on the range. He picked up one of the spent .30 caliber carbine casings from the frozen grass. The brass caught the last light of day, glinting like a small warning. He had once believed that quality would triumph over quantity, that German engineering excellence would offset numerical disadvantages. But standing there, holding evidence of American industrial philosophy, he understood the flaw in that belief. Quality required time, quantity required only will, and America had both. The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of snow. Richter pocketed the casing and turned toward the facility. Tomorrow he would begin writing his report, but he already knew what it would conclude. The M1 carbine was not a weapon to be dismissed. It was a symptom of a larger reality. The Americans were not trying to build better soldiers. They were building more soldiers who could fight effectively from day one. That night, in his office, Richter laid out the components of the M1 carbine on his desk. The receiver, the barrel, the trigger group, the magazine. Each piece told the same story. He thought about the German armaments industry, already strained by demands for tanks, aircraft, and artillery. Could they even produce a comparable weapon in the numbers needed? He knew the answer. Germany built artistry, America built volume, and in war, volume was becoming the only currency that mattered. He opened his notebook and began to write. The captured M1 carbine represents a philosophical departure from traditional small arms doctrine. Its value lies not in superior performance, but in the democratization of firepower. By arming support personnel with a weapon capable of sustained semi-automatic fire, the enemy achieves a force multiplication that cannot be countered by superior marksmanship alone. He paused, staring at the words. They felt like a confession. Then he continued. Recommendation. Germany must develop and field a similar to intermediate weapon system. However, given current production constraints, This may not be feasible within a time frame relevant to the present conflict. The sentence was as close as he could come to admitting defeat without writing the word itself. Outside, an air raid siren began to wail. Richter set down his pen and moved to the window, watching searchlights sweep the sky. Somewhere above, Allied bombers were approaching, each one protected by escorts armed with .50 caliber machine guns and crewed by men who likely carried M1 carbines as personal weapons. Every layer of the American war machine was armed, mobile, and lethal. The siren's wail faded, replaced by the distant crump of anti-aircraft guns. Richter returned to his desk and picked up the carbine's magazine, its 15-round capacity mocking the 5-round capacity of the rifle that had served Germany for half a century. History was written by those who adapted fastest, and in that moment, Richter knew which side had adapted and which had clung too long to the past. Richter's report reached the Waffenamt headquarters in Berlin 3 days later. It passed through the hands of bureaucrats who underlined phrases like simplified construction and mass production with red pencil, marking them as evidence of American industrial crudeness rather than strategic advantage. The conclusion was filed alongside hundreds of other technical assessments, most of which would never influence procurement decisions already locked into production contracts signed years earlier. But one copy found its way to the desk of General Major Friedrich Fromm, Chief of Army Equipment and Commander of the Replacement Army. Fromm read it twice, then summoned his staff. In a windowless conference room deep within the ministry building, he laid the report on the table. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice edged with frustration, "we are losing the small arms war, and no one wants to admit it." The officers exchanged uncomfortable glances. One spoke up. "Herr General, our Mauser rifles remain superior in accuracy and range. The Kar-98 is the finest bolt-action rifle ever produced." Fromm cut him off. "And how many can we produce per month?" The officer hesitated. "Approximately 60,000, across all manufacturers." Fromm nodded. "The Americans are producing 300,000 M1 carbines per month." 300,000. He let the number hang in the air. Another officer, younger and less cautious, leaned forward. "But Herr General, quantity without quality is meaningless. 5 well-aimed shots from a Mauser are worth 15 poorly aimed shots from an inferior weapon." Fromm picked up the report and read aloud. During testing, an inexperienced soldier achieved 12 hits out of 15 rounds at 100 meters with the M1 carbine. The same soldier achieved 2 hits out of 5 with the Karabiner 98. He set the paper down. "Tell me again about quality." The room fell silent. Fromm continued, his tone measured but grim. "We built rifles for sharpshooters. They built rifles for armies. We assumed superior training would offset numerical disadvantages. They assumed superior numbers would create their own advantage." He stood, pacing to a map of Europe pinned to the wall. Every blue pin represented a German front, every red pin, an Allied advance. "Look at this," he said, gesturing to the Italian peninsula where red pins clustered thickly. "Every support soldier, every driver, every clerk the Americans land carries a weapon capable of semi-automatic fire. Our support troops carry pistols. When their rear echelon is attacked, they fight back with carbines. When ours is attacked, they retreat or die." The strategic implications were becoming impossible to ignore. Germany's doctrine relied on concentrated combat power at the front lines, with logistics and support trailing behind. The Americans blurred that distinction, creating an army where depth and rear areas were nearly as lethal as the forward edge. One officer ventured a question. "Could we not develop our own intermediate weapon?" Fromm laughed bitterly. "With what? Steel is rationed. Every factory is committed to existing contracts. The Sturmgewehr program is consuming resources meant for 20 other projects. Even if I authorized a carbine program today, production would not begin until 1945 at the earliest. By then, the Americans will have armed millions." He returned to his chair, suddenly looking older than his 53 years. The war is no longer won by the soldier with the best rifle. It is won by the nation that can arm every man who wears a uniform. We are a nation of craftsmen fighting an empire of factories. The distinction, he did not need to say, was proving fatal. Across the Atlantic, in a town called Winchester, Connecticut, the night shift was beginning. The factory floor stretched nearly a quarter mile, illuminated by overhead lights that turned the space into a cathedral of industry. The sound was overwhelming. The rhythmic stamp of presses, the whine of milling machines, the clatter of conveyor belts carrying parts from one station to the next. 3,000 workers moved in orchestrated chaos, each performing a single task repeated thousands of times per shift. At Station 47, a woman named Mary Patterson fed receiver blanks into a turret lathe. Each blank entered as a rough casting and emerged 12 seconds later as a precisely machined component, the interior milled to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. She had been doing this for 8 months, since her husband shipped out to the Pacific with the 1st Marine Division. Every receiver that passed through her hands was a promise she made to him and to every other man fighting under the same flag. She did not know that her work would be studied by German engineers who could not comprehend how such precision could be achieved at such scale. She only knew that if she maintained her pace, 900 receivers would be completed by the end of her shift. Across the floor, another worker installed trigger assemblies. Another fitted barrels, another tested gas pistons. The carbine moved down the line like a living thing, growing from scattered parts into a complete weapon in just under 40 minutes. Near the end of the line, an inspector named Thomas Chen examined each finished carbine with a practiced eye. He checked headspace with a gauge, cycled the action 15 times, test-fired 3 rounds into a sand trap, and either stamped the receiver with an acceptance mark or set it aside for rework. His rejection rate was less than 2%. Not because standards were low, but because every component had been manufactured to such uniform specifications that assembly was almost foolproof. Chen had emigrated from Guangdong province in 1932, working first as a machinist in a tool and die shop, before the war brought him to Winchester. He understood what the Germans did not. That precision was not the opposite of mass production. It was the foundation. Every jig, every fixture, every cutting tool was calibrated to ensure that the 10,000th part matched the first. The secret was not in the hands of the worker, but in the design of the system that guided those hands. In the quality control office, a young engineer named Robert Hayes reviewed the day's production figures. 14,000 carbines completed in 24 hours, 18 rejected for various defects, acceptable losses, well within specifications. He initialed the report and moved to the next task, reviewing a proposal to increase barrel production by modifying the rifling process. If approved, output would increase by 12% within 30 days. Hayes had graduated from MIT in 1941 with a degree in mechanical engineering. He had expected to design aircraft engines or turbines. Instead, he found himself optimizing the manufacture of a weapon that would be fired by men he would never meet, in places he could barely pronounce. The work was unglamorous, but its importance was undeniable. Every improvement in efficiency meant more carbines in fewer hours. More carbines meant more soldiers armed. More soldiers armed meant the war ended sooner. He thought about the German engineers who would eventually study captured carbines, trying to understand how America could produce such volume without sacrificing quality. The answer, he knew, would frustrate them. It was not genius. It was process. It was the systematic elimination of variability, the standardization of every dimension, the use of interchangeable parts that could be assembled by workers with minimal training. The Germans built rifles the way medieval craftsmen built swords, one at a time, each unique, each requiring skilled hands. America built rifles the way Henry Ford built cars, identically, relentlessly, in numbers that overwhelmed the capacity to count them. In the break room during the midnight meal break, workers sat in clusters, smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee from thermoses. Mary Patterson sat with 3 other women from her line. One of them, an older woman named Dorothy, showed a photograph of her son in uniform, somewhere in North Africa. "He wrote that they gave him one of these," Dorothy said, holding up a newspaper clipping that showed a soldier with an M1 Carbine. "Says it's light enough to carry all day and hits hard enough to matter." Mary nodded. "Then we better keep making them." The conversation was brief, matter of fact. These women did not speak of patriotism or duty in grand terms. They spoke of sons, husbands, brothers. The carbines they built were not abstractions, they were lifelines. When the shift whistle blew at 0600, the day crew filed in and the night crew filed out. The machines never stopped. The conveyor belts kept moving. In the parking lot, workers climbed into cars and climbed into cars, buses, heading home to sleep before returning 12 hours later to do it all again. Above the factory entrance, a banner read, "Production for Victory." Beneath it, a tally board updated daily. Carbines produced this month, 287,340. By the time Richter's report circulated through German military intelligence, the number would be over 300,000, and that was just Winchester. Other contractors, inland manufacturing, Underwood typewriter, Rock-Ola, even a jukebox company, had been converted to carbine production. Each one followed the same blueprints, used the same tooling specifications, and produced parts that could be mixed interchangeably. A barrel made in Michigan could be fitted to a receiver from Connecticut without adjustment. This was the genius the Germans could not replicate, not because they lacked skilled engineers, but because their industrial base was fragmented, their factories optimized for craftsmanship rather than volume, and their resources stretched across too many competing priorities. Germany could build magnificent weapons in limited numbers. America could build adequate weapons in infinite numbers. And in total war, infinity was the only number that mattered. Back in Kummersdorf, Richter received a response to his report. It was brief, almost dismissive. Findings noted. No immediate action required. Continue evaluation of captured enemy equipment as resources permit. He read it twice, then filed it away. No immediate action required. The phrase was a bureaucratic euphemism for, "We cannot afford to act on this." He walked to the storage room where the M1 Carbine sat on a shelf alongside other captured weapons. He picked it up, feeling its weight, running his hand along the stock. Somewhere in America, another carbine identical to this one was being built at this very moment. And another. And another. An endless stream of weapons flowing to an army that seemed to grow larger every month. He thought about the workers he would never meet, the Mary Pattersons and Thomas Chens and Robert Hayeses, who built these weapons with the same systematic precision that built automobiles and refrigerators and radios. They were not soldiers, but they were waging war as surely as any rifleman in a foxhole. Their battlefield was the factory floor. Their weapons were lathes and presses and assembly jigs, and they were winning. Richter set the carbine down and returned to his office. He had other reports to write, other weapons to evaluate. But the M1 Carbine had taught him something that no amount of tactical analysis could convey. Modern war was not decided by the quality of individual weapons, but by the capacity to produce them faster than the enemy could destroy them. Germany had entered the war believing in the superiority of its arms. It would end the war drowning in the volume of its enemies. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. That winter, as snow fell across Europe, the contrast between German and American small arms production became impossible to ignore. German ordnance factories, many of them underground to avoid bombing, struggled to maintain output. Raw materials were scarce, skilled workers had been conscripted. Machinery, worn from years of continuous operation, broke down with increasing frequency. The production of Kar-98s fell to 40,000 per month, then 30,000. Meanwhile, American carbine production continued to accelerate. By January 1944, total production exceeded 1 million units. By spring, 2 million. Each one came with 15-round magazines, produced in even greater numbers, 10 magazines for every carbine, 15 rounds per magazine, 150 rounds of immediate firepower for every soldier who carried one. The mathematics were brutal. A German infantry squad of 10 men, armed with Kar-98s and one MP40, could deliver approximately 60 aimed shots before needing to reload. An American squad with M1 Garands and carbines could deliver over 120 shots in the same time, all semi-automatic, all without working a bolt. The difference was not in courage or training. It was in the tools they carried and the industries that supplied them. In March 1944, Richter was summoned to Berlin for a conference on small arms development. The meeting took place in a bunker beneath the Bendler Block, the Army High Command headquarters. 24 officers and engineers gathered around a long table covered with weapons, German, American, British, Soviet. The purpose was to assess whether Germany could develop a universal weapon to replace the aging Kar-98. A colonel from the infantry school at Döberitz spoke first. Our soldiers need a weapon that combines the range of a rifle with the firepower of a submachine gun. The Americans have achieved this with their Garand. We must do the same. Another officer disagreed. The Garand is too heavy, too complex. It requires resources we cannot spare. We should focus on increasing MP40 production and issuing them more widely. Richter listened in silence as the debate circled the same arguments he had heard for months. Finally, the presiding general turned to him. Hauptmann Richter, you have examined the American carbine extensively. What is your assessment? Can we produce something similar? Richter chose his words carefully. The M1 Carbine is not a superior weapon in any single category. It is inferior in range to a rifle and less lethal at close quarters than a submachine gun. Its advantage lies in being adequate for most combat situations while requiring minimal training and resources to deploy effectively. He paused, aware that every man in the room was watching him. To replicate this weapon, we would need to standardize production across multiple factories, retool for stamped parts rather than machined components, and commit to producing millions of units over several years. We would also need the raw materials, steel, walnut, springs, magazines. Given our current situation, this is not feasible. The room absorbed his words in heavy silence. The general leaned back in his chair. So, your recommendation is to do nothing? Richter met his gaze. My recommendation is to acknowledge that we are fighting an industrial war with a craftsman's mindset. The Americans do not have better soldiers or better weapons. They have more soldiers and more weapons. Until we accept this reality, we will continue to be surprised by their success. The statement was as close to insubordination as Richter had ever come. But no one challenged him. They all knew he was right. The meeting adjourned without resolution. As the officers filed out, one of them, a major from the Ordnance Office, pulled Richter aside. You are correct, of course, he said quietly. But correctness does not win wars. We have lost, the industrial race. All that remains is to see how long we can hold the line with what we have. Richter nodded. He had known this for months, perhaps longer, but hearing it spoken aloud gave it a finality that was difficult to bear. That night, he returned to Kummersdorf and wrote a personal letter to a colleague, an engineer who had emigrated to Switzerland before the war. In it, he described the M1 Carbine tests and his conclusions. He ended with a sentence that would be found decades later in a Swiss archive. We have learned too late that wars are not won by the elegance of design, but by the ability to produce faster than the enemy can destroy. He sealed the letter and set it aside. Outside, the sound of distant artillery drifted through the cold air. The front was moving closer, kilometre by kilometre, day by day. And with it came soldiers armed with weapons built in factories that never slept, fed by supply lines that stretched across oceans, supported by a nation that had turned industry into its greatest weapon. In America, the factories continued their rhythm. Mary Patterson fitted receivers, Thomas Chen inspected carbines, Robert Hayes optimized production. They did not know about Richter or his report. They did not know that German engineers had studied their work and found it unstoppable. They only knew that their shift started in an hour, and there were carbines to build, and the war would not wait. The M1 Carbine was not a miracle of engineering. It was something more practical and more powerful. The embodiment of industrial capacity turned toward a singular purpose. Every weapon that rolled off the assembly line was a message to the enemy, spoken in steel and walnut and stamped parts. The message was simple. We can build faster than you can destroy. We can arm more soldiers than you can field. We can sustain this effort longer than you can resist it. By the summer of 1944, as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, over 3 million M1 carbines had been produced. They were carried by paratroopers dropping into France, by tank crews rumbling through hedgerows, by officers coordinating assaults, by engineers clearing obstacles. Every branch of service, every theatre of war, every type of unit had soldiers carrying the light, handy weapon that German engineers had once dismissed as inadequate. Richter heard the reports from France. American forces, advancing with firepower that seemed limitless. German positions overrun not by superior tactics, but by overwhelming volume of fire. Soldiers who had expected to face bolt-action rifles found themselves suppressed by semi-automatic weapons wielded by men who should have been armed with pistols. The front lines blurred. Rear areas became combat zones. The distinction between combatant and support troops dissolved. He remembered the first day he had held the captured carbine, how light it had seemed, how crude. He had been looking for flaws in the weapon when he should have been looking for the philosophy behind it. The Americans had not set out to build the best rifle. They had set out to arm an entire nation for war, and they had succeeded by making adequacy abundant. In his final report on small arms, written in August 1944, as the Reich began its slow collapse, Richter wrote, "The M1 Carbine represents the future of infantry combat, not because it is perfect, but because it is ubiquitous. In the coming wars, victory will belong to nations that can equip every soldier with sufficient firepower, not to those who equip a few soldiers with exceptional firepower." The report was filed and forgotten. By the time it might have influenced doctrine, there was no doctrine left to influence. But the lesson remained, carved into the reality of battlefields, from Italy to the Pacific. The age of the rifleman-craftsman was over. The age of the armed mass had begun, and it had announced itself with the sharp crack of a .30 caliber carbine, repeated 15 times before the magazine ran dry, multiplied by millions. The war ended in May 1945, but Ernst Richter's education in industrial warfare continued long after the guns fell silent. He surrendered to American forces near Leipzig, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel containing his notes and reports. The irony was not lost on him that he was disarmed by a young lieutenant who carried an M1 carbine slung casually over his shoulder, as if it weighed nothing at all. In the displaced persons camp where he awaited processing, Richter saw hundreds of captured weapons stacked in open-air depots, mountains of Kar-98s, their woodstocks bleached by sun and rain, piles of MP40s tangled together like metal brambles. And among them, scattered like seeds, dozens of American carbines abandoned or discarded by soldiers who knew another would replace it without effort. One afternoon, an American sergeant allowed him to examine a carbine from the pile. It was battered, the stock scratched and dented, the barrel worn from thousands of rounds, but when Richter worked the action, it cycled smoothly. He pulled the trigger on an empty chamber, and the hammer fell with a crisp snap. Even abused and neglected, it functioned. He handed it back with something approaching reverence. "How many of these did you make?" he asked in broken English. The sergeant shrugged. "Millions." "I guess?" "They gave one to damn near everybody." Richter nodded slowly. That was the answer to every question he had asked during the war. How many? Millions. How fast? Faster than you can count. How long? As long as it takes. In 1946, under Operation Paperclip, Richter was recruited by the United States Army Ordnance Corps. His expertise in small arms evaluation made him valuable, despite his former allegiance. He was sent to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, where he joined a team analyzing captured Axis weapons and developing post-war doctrine. The facility was vast, sprawling across thousands of acres, with firing ranges that stretched to the horizon. On his first day, a young American engineer gave him a tour of the small arms testing section. They walked past rows of weapons from every nation: British Stens, Soviet PPSs, Japanese Arisakas, and entire walls of American firearms. The engineer, noticing Richter's interest in the M1 carbines, picked one up. "You probably know these pretty well," he said with a smile. "I heard you guys studied them during the war." Richter accepted the weapon, its familiar weight settling into his hands like an old acquaintance. "I wrote a report," he said quietly. "I told them this weapon would change infantry combat. They filed it away." The engineer nodded sympathetically. "Yeah, we had plenty of people who didn't believe in it either. Thought it was too light, too weak, not a real rifle. But you know what? It worked. Not because it was perfect, but because we could get it to everyone who needed it." That phrase stayed with Richter for years. Not because it was perfect, but because we could get it to everyone who needed it. It was the distillation of everything he had learned too late. Perfection was a luxury afforded to those with time and resources. Adequacy distributed widely was a strategy available to those with industrial might. Over the following months, Richter reviewed after-action reports from the Pacific and European theatres. He read accounts of carbine-armed soldiers holding positions against numerically superior forces. He studied casualty data showing that support troops armed with carbines had significantly higher survival rates than those armed only with pistols. He examined maintenance records, proving that the carbine required a fraction of the service hours needed for more complex weapons. Every data point confirmed what he had suspected in 1943. The M1 carbine had not won the war through superiority, but through presence. It had been there when needed, in the hands of soldiers who might otherwise have been defenseless. It had turned clerks into fighters, rear areas into defended zones, and logistics personnel into combat-capable troops. In 1948, Richter was asked to contribute to a study on future infantry weapons. He wrote a section that would later be cited in doctrinal publications. The lesson of the M1 carbine is not about ballistics or accuracy. It is about distribution of capability. An army where every soldier can deliver rapid fire is more resilient than an army where only specialized troops possess such capability. The weapon itself is secondary to the philosophy of arming widely rather than arming optimally. His American colleagues nodded approvingly when they read it. One of them, a colonel who had commanded infantry in France, added a note in the margin: "Richter gets it." Most people still don't. On a cold morning in November 1950, Richter stood on a firing range at Aberdeen, watching a demonstration of new weapons under development. Among them was an early prototype of what would become the M14 rifle, a weapon that attempted to combine the power of the Garand with lessons learned from the carbine. He noticed immediately that it held 20 rounds in a detachable magazine, that it was designed for select fire capability, that every dimension had been optimized for mass production. The Americans had not abandoned their philosophy. They had refined it. The young engineer supervising the test approached him. "What do you think, Ernst?" Richter watched the target shredder downrange. "I think you have learned to build abundance without sacrificing quality. That is something my country never mastered." The engineer smiled. "We had good teachers. Your reports on the carbine, the ones we found after the war, they helped us understand what we'd done right, even if we didn't fully appreciate it at the time." Richter felt a strange emotion, something between pride and melancholy. His warnings had gone unheeded by his own nation, but they had been validated by his former enemy. There was poetry in that, though it was the kind of poetry written in rust and regret. That evening, in his small apartment near the base, Richter opened his old leather satchel and removed the notebooks he had kept throughout the war. He paged through them slowly, reading observations written in dim bunkers and cold workshops. On one page, dated October 1943, he had written, The American carbine is too light to be effective. He had crossed it out weeks later and written beneath it, "The American carbine is light enough to be carried by everyone." The difference between those two sentences was the difference between losing and winning. He thought about the workers in Winchester, the Mary Pattersons who had built weapons while their loved ones fought. He thought about the engineers who had designed not for glory, but for function. He thought about the soldiers who had carried carbines through jungles and deserts and hedgerows, trusting their lives to 15 rounds of 30 caliber ammunition in a weapon that weighed less than 6 pounds. They had all been part of a system that valued pragmatism over perfection, distribution over distinction, and volume over virtuosity. It was not a romantic way to wage war, but it was an effective one. And in the end, effectiveness was the only metric that mattered. Richter closed the notebook and set it aside. He had spent years studying weapons, analyzing their strengths and weaknesses, seeking the perfect balance of power and precision. But the M1 Carbine had taught him that perfection was an illusion. What mattered was not whether a weapon was ideal, but whether it was there when needed, in sufficient numbers, in the hands of those who would use it. The Germans had built for excellence. The Americans had built for everyone. And in the mathematics of total war, everyone always outnumbered. Excellence. He walked to the window and looked out at the Maryland countryside, dark under a moonless sky. Somewhere in that darkness, factories still hummed, producing weapons for the next conflict, the next challenge, the next war that would demand not the best soldiers with the best weapons, but the most soldiers with sufficient weapons. The lesson had been written in steel and stamped parts, in 15-round magazines and semi-automatic fire, in the hands of millions who had carried a weapon that German engineers once dismissed as inadequate. Richter understood now that adequacy, when multiplied by millions, became overwhelming. And overwhelming, not exceptional, was how wars were won. He had learned this truth too late to save his nation, but he had learned it thoroughly enough to teach it to the next generation. And perhaps that was its own form of victory, the kind measured not in battles won, but in wisdom gained and shared, the kind that ensured the lesson would never need to be learned again at such terrible cost. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.